Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Monday, June 30th, last day of June 2025. And on Mondays, we talk about mathematics and statistics. Some of you know this week's theme for the Dr. J Vlog series is improving the world. Now, I've often heard people talk about how they didn't think they were very good at math or they had a phobia, and they couldn't understand why they were being tortured for all those years in public school, when they were growing up, especially since they figured they would never have to use this math anyway. And that's a fair point. I don't recall many of my teachers spending much time talking about the possible connections between mathematics and solving real-world problems. Now, that said, did you see the film Hidden Figures? I hope you did. If you haven't, highly recommend it. So it's a movie that depicts the journey in part of Katherine Johnson and a couple of her African-American female friends who were also mathematicians, and they all worked at NASA during the 1960s and the space race. And in the case of Johnson, it was her calculations in particular that were critical to the success of the Apollo moon landing program. And she also then ultimately became NASA's first African-American female engineer. So, in general, new mathematics is a key to innovations in most science and technology and engineering and mathematics-related fields, the so-called STEM fields. But mathematical modeling is increasingly used in the social sciences as well, all of them. And in fact, mathematical models are used in music, in linguistics, and even analytic philosophy. So, mathematical modelers essentially use ideas from mathematics as well as computational algorithms and techniques from stats and operations research. And they use these to tackle big, messy, real-world problems. So in a nutshell, what one does with mathematical modeling is create a representation of a system or a problem, identify certain key parameters that are believed or known to affect that system, and then use the modeling techniques to better understand the system's behavior and make predictions and potentially solve the problem. So to solve modeling problems, mathematicians have to make assumptions, choose a specific approach, get a solution, evaluate that solution in terms of its usefulness and accuracy, and then rework and adjust the model or readjust it to look at different results based on different assumptions. Okay, but even if you, without doing the complicated modeling, I found that like within university teaching, just teaching basic statistics and showing students how to interpret correlations and test for statistical significance in a relationship, these sorts of things often blow people's minds. It's not particularly complicated, but what I find so fascinating is that when they see how factor X affects factor Y under these conditions, for example, they almost always start to see the value of statistics and mathematics and all that stuff that they've been afraid of or they never thought they'd understand, they've been avoiding all their lives. And indeed, even if you're not good at mathematical calculations, even if you don't feel like you'll ever understand the calculations fully, the good news is these days we don't have to be the human computers, the actual computers any longer ourselves necessarily, but rather we rely on the technology, the physical computers to do the heavy lifting. Right? But for that matter, we typically have data sets then with hundreds or thousands of cases, countless parameters, and then we ask the computer to perform a number of mathematical operations, and we get the results almost instantaneously. So it's far easier these days, at least on the computational side. And that's why I think more and more people then, even if you're not a math person, can get involved in the field. Now, that said, it's still, in my opinion, it's still a good idea to at least learn the basic logic behind the mathematical and the statistical concepts that you're going to be using. I distinctly remember one Saturday night while I was in university, and I was taking my first university-level stats course. And I spent that Saturday night at my mother's kitchen table with a notepad, pencils, erasers, and an old-fashioned calculator, hand calculator. And I spent the evening calculating something known as regression equations. Now, again, those of you who have taken a stats course know this. Maybe you've even heard of the techniques even outside of even if you haven't taken stats. But essentially, I was doing these by hand instead of with a computer. I didn't have a computer at home. PCs weren't a thing back then in the Paleozoic era. So I was doing this stuff by hand and using the calculator to assist. And I wanted to understand precisely how the mathematics worked so that I could understand regression at a much deeper level. And by the way, I remember my mother asking me too, what are you doing? And I explained what I just shared with you, and she just kind of shook her head, right? So while most normal university students were, at the college basketball game, or maybe they were out partying or, trying to get laid, who knows what college students do. I was sitting at the table, and this is absolutely true, doing math and regression equations. I'm sorry, I just found that infinitely more interesting. And in fact, that's when I really started, I sort of had that aha moment. I learned the core concepts, and then I immediately started seeing the implications for doing more complex types of statistical analyses. And so I learned various techniques in grad school. I didn't become a mathematician as such. I was always pretty good at math, but that wasn't something that I wanted to devote my life doing. But I learned a lot of these more advanced analytic techniques. I learned a ton about how to use the computers, of course, to generate meaningful results. And I've used at least certain of these techniques on various projects ever since. Depends on the project. And so that's in part why I remember that Saturday night so clearly. So I think part of the problem then is how we teach math. And we're way too formulaic in that sense. And we don't spend enough time showing people how and why the math matters. So simply put, I think the way that students tend to learn mathematics, especially in school, in grade school, public school, really doesn't resemble the way a mathematician does it, or how we use math in business and computing and science and engineering and so on. So I've learned to simulate the use of real life situations in my classroom teaching with statistics. So yeah, again, I teach the basic concepts, and I do have to look at do a bit of a deeper dive in terms of the mathematics behind it, but I don't tell the students to remember the mathematics per se. I just want them to have exposure and understand how the basic concepts work. And instead, what I'll do is we'll jump ahead. Once we've covered the basics, and I'll ask the students to imagine, for example, that they're head of the Ministry of Education or the school board or whatever, and they're tasked with evaluating a new curriculum that's intended to help students improve their, let's just say, for example, math competency scores. And so I'll give them information or data. Typically, I'll make it up, but you can actually pull it from real publications for that matter. And I'll ask them to evaluate the research using a statistical technique that they've learned, okay? And I can manipulate the results to show, for example, whether there's a tiny gain in the test scores, right? Whatever the case, typically I'll ask them to say, compare the data between students who are using the old curriculum versus students who are using the new curriculum, and see if there's any statistically significant difference in their results. And so, as I say, once we generate those results, I then ask the students to interpret those results and discuss the possible implications of the differences in terms of cost and overall efficacy of the proposed revisions and so on. So in short, many people are going to be in leadership positions down the road in business or government, the nonprofit sector, what have you. And even if they don't do the math themselves, they might have to evaluate the information. They might have to make decisions based on the analytic results. And so that's why I always encourage people to engage in rigorous research, try to generate the most accurate results possible, at least given the available resources and the conditions that are affecting that research. And remember, at the end of the day, the facts never speak for themselves. You've heard me say this previously. We always have to interpret the results and offer tentative conclusions accordingly. And even then, we have to defend those conclusions. What are our justifications for them, and so on. So once more, I think mathematical modeling problems are especially interesting because they're usually quite practical in nature. They relate to issues that we need to understand because we have to make decisions about big topics about important types of research, like whether a particular drug that's been developed is safe, is it effective, should it be made available to the public? And modeling makes mathematics then relevant to the real problems like this that we have to try to solve. And also note that we usually make the requirements for determining significant causal relationships much stricter if we're dealing with drugs or potentially life and death situations, shall we say. So if you're talking about the possibly negative or even lethal consequences of drugs or a new drug that's being proposed, then you have to be extremely cautious. And in fact, we establish much higher and stricter confidence levels that have to be met if we're dealing with, again, life and death situations of the effects of drugs, for example. We'll raise the bar, shall we say, to establish a significant relationship much higher than the error that might be associated, for example, with a typical public opinion poll. If we get that a little bit wrong, or if we're off by a couple percentage points or whatever, it's no big deal. But if you're talking about the effects of a drug, well, you can appreciate the difference. Or consider roller coasters. One of my favorites. I love roller coasters. I know there are people who refuse to go on roller coasters for various reasons. But if you're worried about the safety issues, again, that's fair, at least at the outset. But understand that the engineering that's involved in creating safe roller coasters is quite excellent these days. So, for example, the cables that are used, that are designed, that are used on roller coasters, are designed to be significantly stronger than the load that they're going to be asked to carry, typically with a design factor of 5 or more. So what does that mean? Well, simply put, the cable's braking strength is at least 5 times the maximum anticipated load. Okay, and in fact, there was one study that I was looking at because I was interested in this topic some years ago, and they actually used a design factor of 10, meaning the cables are at least 10. So the cables that were designed for the roller coaster had to be able to, or they were designed to withstand the G forces and all the other forces and the weight of the passengers, etc. Everything to a factor of at least 10 times as much as the anticipated maximum load. So again, the chances of the cable breaking were almost zero. You can never say with 100% certainty, but we're talking about almost a 0% chance of the cables breaking. And that's true of roller coasters everywhere these days. Could it happen? Sure, but again, chances are extremely small. You're much more likely, by comparison, to fly out of the roller coaster because the seatbelt mechanism failed or wasn't secured properly, that sort of thing. And actually, that's quite rare too. I shouldn't say that. I've got to be careful here. I don't want to scare anybody. But that's quite rare too because of the backup systems that are typically built in as well. Right? So we talk about fail-safe designs, or at least attempts in that regard. So if the primary restraint, for example, like the over-the-shoulder harness or the lap bar, somehow were to fail, then the seatbelt is typically designed as a backup system. And then, you could even have a situation like a friend of mine where if everything else fails, which is what happened to him as a small child, they didn't put his seatbelt on this one of those huge swings that circle around. So I won't name the friend of mine. But anyway, they didn't put his seatbelt on properly. They went swinging out over this cliff and so forth. Really scary, really exciting. But he didn't have his seatbelt on properly. And he's starting to slide off of the seat. And what saved him was his dad. So his dad had to reach over, kind of like this, and just serve as his seatbelt for the entire, you can't stop the thing. They don't necessarily know what's going on up there, right? But his dad had to hold on to him basically for the entire ride. Can you imagine? Anyway. All right. Well, this leads to my final point then. It's usually best then to work in teams if you're going to be trying to solve more difficult problems, trading ideas, check each other's work, provide feedback, and so on. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with being a genius. If you are one, or you happen to figure out complex problems on your own, great. But the real mathematical modeling problems are typically so big and messy that in order to solve the problem, especially if you're working with tight timelines and so on, you almost always need a team to come up with an optimal solution or set of solutions. because real-world problems are indeed multifaceted, open to multiple approaches typically. And so it's good to work with a team then where you can have people with different strengths and expertise contributing to the overall project. And of course, that's what happens with the major efforts like NASA, like trying to put people on the moon and whatever. And usually, of course, the other benefit there is that we can always learn things that we didn't know from others on the team. So that's another kind of personal benefit, if you will. And everyone then can help make the solution better and the communications much more effective. So that's my recommendation in that regard. But yeah, we have to use the mathematical modeling and the statistics at our disposal if we have any hope of solving especially the larger, complex, messier real-world problems that we're inevitably going to be confronted with. Okay, that's it for today's vlog. Tomorrow we're going to move on to talking about music and the arts and how we can use those in relation to improving the world. But until then, and as ever, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance. And I hope to see you tomorrow.